In this presentation, I'll be going over 15 photos throughout the course of the Cold War and explaining in detail what these photos are and the significance of each photo. This is a photo that was taken during the Yalta Conference during the periods of February 4th to February 11th of 1945. This photo shows long-term causes of the Cold War and leaders and nations that were involved. The Yalta Conference was one of the big three conferences where President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin met to discuss the Allied war effort against Germany and Japan to settle post-war disputes. What makes this a long-term cause for the Cold War is that the disputes over Poland. Soviet troops were already in control of Poland. A pro-communist provisional government had already been established, and Stalin was adamant that Russia's interest in that nation must be recognized. However, the other two governments felt that it was best if Poland was left alone and had its own free election. This paved the way this paved the way for tensions and disagreements between the United States and Soviet Union, and is considered what sparked the lasting Cold War. This is also the beginning of the bookending images that will be related at the end of the presentation and for its relation towards Poland. Ideas of territorial consequences of the Cold War. During the periods of July 14th and August 2nd of 1945 was when the Potsdam Conference took place. The conference formally divided Germany and Austria into four zones. It was also agreed that the German capital, Berlin, would be divided into four zones. The conference declared that the country would be temporarily divided into American, Soviet, British, and French zones, each zone to be administered by an army of occupation led by a commander-in-chief. Soon it became clear that Stalin was laying down the foundation for an entirely separate East German nation state, modeled not on the best traditions and values of the German people, but rather on those of the Soviet Union. This is what led to the formation of the Berlin Wall and splitting of East and West Berlin, therefore showing the territorial consequences throughout the Cold War. This is a picture of the atomic bombs exploding over Hiroshima and Nagasaki around the end of World War II and just at the beginning of the Cold War. This can be seen as a short-term cause and in relation to the arms race that were between the Soviet Union and the United States as the Cold War took off. On August 6th, the first atomic bomb was detonated, August 6, 1945, and the second was August 8, 1945. So in August 1945, the USA detonated these two atomic bombs over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The intention was to force Japan to surrender, thus avoiding a long war in the Pacific. Although this had brought to an end one war, it can be considered as something that helped develop the Cold War along its course. In 1949, the USSR tested its first atomic bomb. This led to a race between the two superpowers to amass the most powerful nuclear weapons with the most effective delivery systems. The use of nuclear weapons was essentially an arms race between the USSR and the USA. This next photo is Winston Churchill delivering his famous Iron Curtain speech, which gives the audience a better understanding of leaders and nations. On March 5th, 1946, in the famous Iron Curtain speech, Churchill said, "An Iron Curtain has descended across the continent." Churchill's speech is considered one of the announcements of the beginning of the Cold War. The example Churchill gave were warnings against the policies of the Soviet Union that are spreading and becoming more severe. This could be seen through the divisions made during the Potsdam Conference of Germany, in addition to the Iron Curtain that had descended across Eastern Europe. Churchill spoke of communist fifth columns that were operating through Western and Southern Europe. This picture is a picture of soldiers in the Korean War and can be considered as an example of the course of the war, specifically in Asia. The Korean War was seen as a hot war within the Cold War. It was initiated when some 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army poured across the 38th parallel and entering the boundary between the North and South sides. The North was backed by the Communist Soviet Union, and the South was supported by the Democratic United States of America. By July, American troops had entered the war on South Korea's behalf. One of the reasons the United States joined the war was that they believed it was a war against the forces of international communism itself. From the perspectives of the Americans, it wasn't an issue of border dispute. Instead, many feared it was the first step in a communist campaign of global expansion. And the war began on June 25th, 1950. This idea can also be supported by domino theory, which also as an example in the Vietnam War, which stated that once an Asian country had fallen to communism, many more would follow. So, following the Truman Doctrine, the United States felt it was justified to support the South Koreans against a fight against communism. The initial photo taken during the Cold War was taken in Eastern Europe, and it shows the themes of ideology and political consequence. And the photo is a photo taken during the Hungarian Revolution, which happened on October 23rd, 1956. Hungary was strictly governed by the Communist Soviet Union. When they attempted to challenge the rule of Stalin, the people of Hungary were brutally attacked by Soviet forces in suppression of their revolution. Despite the death of Stalin in 1953, the Soviet Union still held predominant control over their territories over Eastern Europe and Hungary specifically. On October 23rd, 1956, Hungarians issued their 16 points, which included personal freedom, more food, the removal of the secret police, the removal of Russian control, and many other demands. What led to the hostile behaviors of the Soviet Union was when Hungary announced they would withdraw themselves from the Warsaw Pact, and on November 4th, Soviet tanks went into Budapest to restore order. It shows the Hungarian people challenging the rule of the communist country of Soviet Union. And the Warsaw Pact was when the Eastern Bloc countries worked together and determined that they would help each other out. So by Hungary removing themselves from this agreement, it shows direct ideas that they would be wishing to break free from the Soviet Union. This was another crucial photo taken throughout the course of the Cold War in the Middle East, which can be considered an economic consequence and also has ideas of fear, shock, and crisis. This photo was taken during the Suez Crisis, which happened on October 30th, 1956. The Suez Crisis broke out when Egyptian leader Nasser ordered the Suez Canal to be nationalized. The outbreak was supported by Soviet arms and money and accompanied by the anger from the United States for falling back on a promise to provide funds for construction of the Aswan Dam on the Nile River. Nasser ordered the Suez Canal seized and nationalized. The Israelis struck first on October 26, 1956. 2 days later, British and French military forces joined them. Soviets were eager to exploit Arab nationalism and gain a foothold in the Middle East. They offered their support for Egypt. Khrushchev also threatened to use nuclear arms if the French and British did not stop these advancements. So, additionally, this is when it can be seen as another conflicting or another agreement between the United States and Soviet Union and on their stance or their goals of contradicting one another and going against each other's nations. And this happened to be in the Middle East where Soviet Union could support Egypt, where the United States fell back on their promises. And the Soviet Union later on did manage to successfully get a foothold in Middle East by intervening in Afghanistan during their own civil war. This photo shows the idea of the space race that was happening during the Cold War, which shows the rivalry, mistrust, and accord between nations and the idea of leaders and nations. As the Cold War developed, the United States and the Soviet Union competed in the development of technology and weaponry. Additionally, the space race was something these two countries prevalently competed in. The Soviet Union made more significant advancements earlier on. The Soviet Union stunned the world on November 3rd, 1957, with the launch of the Sputnik 2. On board was a small satellite with a little dog, Laika, the first animal to orbit Earth. And later, on April 12, 1961, aboard the spacecraft Vostok 1, Soviet astronaut Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human being to travel into space. This competitive nature between the United States and the Soviet Union of developing weapons and technology was a prevalent way of showing their power during the Cold War without actually coming into conflict with one another. This photo was taken during the Bay of Pigs invasion, which showed rivalry, mistrust, and accord between nations, and happened on April 17, 1961. But before then, in 1959, Fidel Castro came into power in an armed revolt that overthrew Cuban dictator Batista. The U.S. government distrusted Castro and was wary of his relationship with Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. The original invasion plan called for two airstrikes against Cuban air bases. A 1,400-man invasion force would disembark under cover of darkness and launch a surprise attack. On April 15th, the bombers took off. However, they had missed all their targets. And on April 17th, Brigade 2506 landed at beaches along the Bay of Pigs and immediately came under heavy fire. This was a failed attempt on the behalf of the United States. The invasion is considered part of the Cold War because the United States was trying to prevent communism from taking hold in the Americas, predominantly in Cuba, which was in such close proximity to their actual country. What quickly followed this was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which embodies the idea of fear, shock, and crisis, and territorial consequence. And this happened on October 14th, 1962, over the span of a few couple days. The Cuban Missile Crisis first took place when a U.S. spy plane reported sighting the construction of a Soviet nuclear missile base in Cuba. From there, Kennedy decided to order a naval blockade around Cuba. By doing this, he declared that the U.S. was prepared to use military force, if necessary, to neutralize the threat to national security. The fear was that the missiles were so close to the U.S. shoreline and could have easily reached them. It was resolved on October 26 when Khrushchev sent a message to Kennedy to agree to remove Cuban missiles in exchange for a promise by U.S. leaders not to invade Cuba. Additionally, another letter was sent secretly declaring that the USSR would disseminate its missiles in Cuba if the Americans removed their missiles installations in Turkey. At first, this letter was objected, but later agreed upon in privately without causing a big scene and having this broadcasted everywhere. The implication of this was that this event was one of the closest points between the two countries where the world was at risk of a full-blown nuclear war. The two leaders were willing to go into these extremes of placing nuclear bases in such proximity of one another that they were at high risk of nuclear war. It can also be considered that if broke out due to territorial advancements of the Soviet Union, the sheer proximity of the situation made it very extreme and at high risk of putting these countries at the risk of nuclear dissemination. This photo is taken during the Vietnam War, which covers the ideas of political consequence and ideology. The Vietnam War was a battle between Communist government of North Vietnam against South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The United States wanted to support the South in order to combat the spread of communist ideologies. What justified the US's intervention was that they were working under the domino theory, which held that if one Southeast Asian country fell to communism, many other countries would follow. Kennedy showed his and the United States support of the South in January of 1973. The United States and North Vietnam concluded a final peace agreement, ending open hostilities between the two nations. War between North and South Vietnam continued, however. The implication of this is that this was a war that was greatly protested against by the Americans. They felt that there was no need to intervene. However, under the Truman Doctrine and following domino theory, Kennedy felt that it was necessary to show their support for the countries threatened by communism. This photo shows the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, otherwise known as START. It shows rivalry, mistrust, and accord, leaders and nations, and political consequence. This photo will primarily be focusing on START 1, since the talks happened in numerous occasions. Arms control negotiations. This was basically arms control negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union, since they were aimed at reducing these two countries' arsenals of nuclear warheads and of the missiles and bombers capable of delivering such weapons. START 1 was in resuming strategic arms negotiations with the Soviet Union in 1982. U.S. President proposed radical reductions rather than merely limitations aimed to superpowers' existing stocks of missiles and warheads. However, in 1983, the Soviet Union abandoned arms control talks in protest against the deployment of intermediate range missiles in Western Europe. It went on to have many other phases. The implications of START were that the negotiations signaled a stark decline in hostility between the two countries. It supported the idea that the Cold War would be coming to a close eventually by limiting the arms race of these two nations and limiting their weapons arsenal. The photo is a representation of President Gorbachev's ideologies of glasnost and perestroika, and it shows political and economic consequence as well as ideology and leaders. On March 11th of 1985, Gorbachev became the new leader of the USSR. In the June of 1987, announces glasnost and perestroika. As head of the Communist Party, Gorbachev launched perestroika. Essentially, he promoted a restructuring of the Soviet economic system. Initially, Gorbachev believed that the basic economic structure of the USSR was sound and therefore only minor reforms were needed. However, he later discovered many changes were needed. Gorbachev later launched glasnost, promoting openness of his governing system. He believed that the opening up of the political system, essentially democratizing it, was the only way to overcome inertia in the political and bureaucratic apparatus that was in the Soviet Union and the atmosphere of uncertainty at that time. This picture is a photo of Soviet withdrawal in Afghanistan and shows the course of the Cold War, specifically in the Middle East. And this happening around February 15th of 1989. However, in 1979 was when this event first took place. It was when Moscow directed military to intervene in the Afghan civil war to maintain power in the communist regime of Kabul. Struggled against the Mujahideen, or fighters for the faith, Taraki's government was overthrown. Soviets saw it as a threat to their influence over a neighboring state sharing a border with three of the USSR's Muslim republics. Soviet intervention in December of 1989 overthrew the government, killed the head of state, Hazifullah Amin, and replaced him with a Soviet-sponsored successor. This led to U.S. intervention and was considered another proxy war of the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. When on February 15, 1989, the Soviet troops finally withdrew their forces. The significance of this is evidence that the Soviet forces were losing their influence within Asia and a sign of their weakening as a whole, signaling that the Soviet control over their territories were coming to a close, and along with it, the Cold War. As mentioned in the first slide of the presentation, we'll be discussing Poland at the end and show how this can be seen as the end of the Cold War. And in particular, we were talking about the collapse of communism in Poland, which happened around August of 1989. It was seen as nearing the end of the period of the Cold War and the removal of the Iron Curtain between Eastern and Western Europe. It was the first Eastern Bloc country to become a democracy. The significance of this was that countries were successfully ridding the rule of the Soviet Union. Countries were now able to dispose of the communist governing system and have a free election to be able to choose their own governing system and their own elected representatives, therefore proving that the Cold War was coming to an end, and this can be seen as a book-ending image.